Okay, folks, this is something I've already done. I'm not going to read all this off because if I did, we'd be here a long time. Check the links underneath the video as per usual. I'll just hit some of the high points on this that I've already. This is America the Overmedicated Part 2, which is a bookend to America the Overmedicated already did, which will be part of a playlist. America the Irresponsible. Part of the reason America is going down the tubes is because there's a lot of irresponsible people. And there's some people that need some tough love. I think progressives especially, they need to accept that we're all created equal. We don't all have equal talents. Like, for example, that fat turd Stan Cedar, or face bloat Sam Cedar, he sucks at marriage. And I don't. He's fat, and I'm not. You know what I mean? Al Sharpton, he can't get a real job. Bernie Sanders never earned a dime in the private sector, never created a job in the private sector. Thomas Massey did. Gary Johnson did create a lot of jobs, made money in the private sector. AOC, she serves drinks to drunks and ferries fries and burgers to tables. If political office was as lucrative now as it was in 1850, she would be bartending her whole life, and she never paid taxes when she had a job in the private sector. So these are the people who are leading us. Yikes. Let's hit some of the high points here. Number one, the drug overdose death rate has steadily climbed since 1979. Now, the drugs that cause these overdoses, that has shifted mightily back and forth in that time frame. Now it's fentanyl is one of the main culprits, but the drug overdose death rate has steadily climbed since 1979, and America has a lot of people who have issues, and many of it can be traced back to being a fatherless child. And the Democrats like it that way. If you seek salvation in a syringe or a bottle, your life will likely end up filled with regret. Many of America's big cities are littered with fathers who hopefully regret not being able to raise their children or refusing. Maybe I should amend that and say they now regret refusing to raise the children they sired and regret procreating with a woman who can't run her own life, let alone someone else's. Number two, drug overdose death rate is so bad that it's even worse in so-called rural areas than it is in urban areas. Please look at the data. This doesn't mean in podunk towns it is worse than places like Chicago, as the CDC definition of rural is probably a bit different than most perceive. However, many cities of less than 100,000 are seeing a massive drug problem. America is irresponsible. Number three, in 2016, the age-adjusted rate of drug overdose deaths in the United States was more than 3 times the rate in 1999. Let me say that again. In 2016, the age-adjusted rate of drug overdose deaths in the United States was more than 3 times the rate in 1999. When Bill Clinton was president, there were a lot more responsible people. When Eisenhower was president, there was a lot more responsible people as a percentage of the entire population. 22 states and the toilet known as the District of Columbia had drug overdose death rates that were higher than the national rate, 19.8 per 100,000. 5 states had rates that were comparable to the national rate, and 23 states had lower rates. West Virginia, Ohio, New Hampshire, and Pennsylvania were the 4 states with the highest observed age-adjusted drug overdose death rates. The District of Columbia had a rate of 38.8 per 100,000. That's almost twice the national average. Iowa, North Dakota, Texas, South Dakota, Iowa represent. Iowa, North Dakota, Texas, South Dakota, and Nebraska were the 5 states with the lowest observed age-adjusted drug overdose death rates. If you want to dig into the state data that I covered, I have sources for that as well. The national drug overdose death rate was 14.7 in 2014. This is per 100,000. 16.3 in 2015. 19.8 in 2016. And 21.7 in 2017. U.S. states that were more than 1 standard deviation above the drug overdose death rate for 2014 through 2017 were West Virginia, which is blowing everybody out of the water. Yikes. Kentucky, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New Hampshire. States like New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Utah are bright spots as their increases, or in Oklahoma's case, a decrease since 2013, were so much lower than the national average, thus pushing them out of the upper echelons. Others, such as the District of Columbia, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Maine and Maryland have seen massive increases, making them some of the worst of a bad lot. Still others, such as Kentucky and West Virginia, remain in serious trouble. America has a problem regarding the dissolution of the nuclear family and a massive drug problem which goes hand in hand with the death of personal responsibility. A sizable portion of America lacks a work ethic and wants to blame someone else for their issues. I'm not a billionaire. Well, most people aren't. How about, I'd settle for, why don't you take care of your children or use a condom and quit reproducing? How about that? Instead of being a billionaire, just concentrate on not producing idiot kids that you're not going to raise. Yes, I'm talking to you, Dayton, Ohio. America's problems start at home, and massive infusions of taxpayer dollars for free this and free that won't solve the problems that begin at home. Let's just be honest and say that a growing minority of Americans aren't very bright, and they're reproducing children that are dysfunctional like them. Asking folks like Bernie Sanders, who never created a job in the private sector and never earned a dime in the private sector, to solve these issues with giant gobs of taxpayer cash would be akin to asking face bloat Sam Cedar to manage a nationalized marriage counseling program. The old man can't even fix his own failed marriage. How can he fix anyone else's problems? It's easy to be conspicuously compassionate when you do not pay the cost. The so-called opioid, this is number 4, the so-called opioid crisis, and remember there's a lot more at the link, the so-called opioid crisis isn't an opioid crisis driven by folks who get hooked on painkillers recovering for surgery. It's a heroin and fentanyl problem, largely driven by junkies who have a long history of abusing themselves. It's also a war on drugs problem caused by prohibition. Ron Paul wanted to ditch all drug laws decades ago because of their damaging, unintended consequences. It's too bad Congress didn't listen. The war on drugs killed Prince, as the Vicodin he was abusing and abusing turned out to be a fatal dose of fentanyl. Now, granted, if he'd have been abusing Vicodin his whole life, I doubt if he'd have made it to another 10 years, because that stuff's really rough on you. But if the prohibition caused him to get it illegally, which he ended up getting fentanyl, and he's dead now. Number 5, I added some information on Chicago because the janitor McCain is through X lives there in her small apartment, and it might come in handy someday soon. Chicago had a major crack epidemic in the 1990s. Now they have a massive opioid problem. You tend to have these issues in jurisdictions with lots of fatherless children. Fentanyl came on the scene so quickly in Chicago that they didn't even begin testing drug overdose victims for it regularly and routinely until June of 2015. Number 6, Elizabeth Warren et al. Think that the government will succeed this time in the war on opioids, but it won't. Warren and senile Bernie Sanders has co-sponsored this as well. It's called the Comprehensive Addiction Resources Emergency Act of 2019, S1365. Warren and Sanders think they can hold drug manufacturers and distributors liable for diversions of opioids for non-medical uses. She'll end up doing what's already being done, harming folks who actually need opioids, not for a high, but for pain relief. Elizabeth Warren is retarded, and so is Jeff Sessions. I wonder if that would work with alcohol. Democrats are drug warriors. Who knew? Apparently, Warren needs to apprise herself of the literature indicating that as opioid prescriptions and prescription volume have plummeted, people removing themselves from the gene pool because of heroin or fentanyl, add cocaine and you have yourself a speedball, have skyrocketed. So the opioid prescriptions and prescription volume plummeted, but the people removing themselves from the gene pool because of heroin and fentanyl overdoses went through the roof. She doesn't seem very well read, but if you know Elizabeth Warren like I do, you realize she's not the brightest bulb in the chandelier. What will we do when government healthcare reimbursements / price controls, FDA drug approval foot dragging, and DEA quotas cause shortages? Tough luck, but I'd wager if you're in Chicago, there's a shady individual willing to sell you some street fentanyl to assist you with your pain. There are other progressives like face bloat Stan Cedar, the failed Air America host who thinks that government employees and edicts are made of a finer clay, and they failed on the war on drugs. However, he thinks they'll win a war on guns. So some Democrats, a war on drugs is a failure, but what would the war on guns, Basically, almost anything the government touches will be a failure. Jeff Sessions, High Chief, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, strange bedfellows indeed. And finally, number 7, America has become a nation of fatherless children, addicts, morons, and lazy people who think they deserve $30,000 a year for running a cash register. We are far removed from the greatest generation. I'm not saying everything was perfect in the 1940s and 50s. After all, there were millions of racist Democrats in the South back then. But we, the people, weren't fathering millions and millions of fatherless children in the midst of a chemical-induced stupor. There were plenty of nefarious politicians back in the 40s and 50s, but we, the people, were largely responsible people overall. And they were responsible for putting those people in office, unfortunately. But the people voting for FDR largely weren't insane. Some of them were, but I'd say overall they weren't, and they were responsible people. That began changing in the 1960s, and folks like Bernie Sanders, AOC, and High Chief Liz Warren want to exploit that by promising them all kinds of free stuff. It's easier to manipulate folks like that and keep them trapped in poverty for generations. Dayton, Ohio, and Chicago have been voting Democrat for 60 years, but they're still poor. I blame the irresponsible we, the people, and they know who they are, as much as I blame Washington for America's failures, most of which start at home. Teach your children well. Read the whole thing. I got the links underneath. It's probably more information than most of these progressive idiots disseminate in a year's worth of videos. America needs a dose of personal responsibility. Don't be stupid, people. Don't be stupid. I mean, but there's a lot of these Democrats in these inner cities. They can't even operate a condom. So how do you expect them to prosper at any sort of job? And raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour guarantees that most of these people will never have a job. But I think Liz Warren and Bernie Sanders want it that way. Have a nice day. And don't thank me now for the sobering info.